Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we are finally going to be talking about the newest album from Nicolas Jaar called Sirens. You know, I say every year that I hope to cover more electronic music, and yet somehow in the last few months of every year, I find myself playing catch up with the acts that I really should have covered months ago. Hence why it has taken so damn long to get to this particular review. And it's not like the album hasn't been on my schedule for some time. I might not have been talking much about music when Nicolas Jaar's critically adored debut album Space Is Only Noise dropped in 2011, but when I did start getting requests to cover him as early as 2015, when he re-entered the spotlight courtesy of a few EPs and soundtrack albums, all the critical acclaim did draw a lot of attention from me. And when I actually went back to Space Is Only Noise, I actually really liked it. The slightly askew melodies, the vocal snippets against scant flutters of glitch, the intense intimacy of every bit of percussion, the haunted vocals, the odd sense of groove that it had. It was a weird as hell album, but it had the sort of ridiculous poise and confidence that made Jaar seem like a veteran, effortlessly crossing and blending styles. Again, like most electronic music that I cover, I will not say that it's for everyone. It's too slow and diffuse to really dance to, not nearly as abrasive as more experimental producers tend to fly, not as melodic to build a lot of more consistent vibes, but not so spacious where it slips towards more ambient tones. But this is music at the intersection of ideas, a fair few of them really weird. And while it didn't all quite work for me on Space Is Only Noise, some of those melodic shifts and vocal samples were something else. I was definitely curious to check out Sirens, especially given how much critical acclaim was dumped on top of it. And now, thanks to consistent votes on Patreon, it's now finally got its chance to shine at the top of my schedule. So, was Sirens worth it? Well, okay, if you all remember that review that I made of the Common album Black America Again, and how in context of that recent election it felt more and more like a distant echo, not quite as relevant? Yeah, Sirens by Nicolas Jaar falls into the exact same category, albeit with a bit more of an excuse given that it was released much earlier and isn't nearly as earnest and borderline utopian as Black America Again was. And yet, if that had been the only issue, I'd be willing to look past it, except that Sirens is also a much more sparse and bleak affair that isn't nearly as eccentric, eclectic, groove-driven, or potent as Space Is Only Noise. Again, it is good, but it doesn't quite coalesce with the same fascinating personality that I really loved, and I can't help but feel that it's not as great as it could have been. Again, it is good, not great. So first we need to talk about the music, and again, the stylistic blend is kind of peculiar, although not entirely unfamiliar given Space Is Only Noise. There's always been a slightly old-fashioned pop style to a lot of the melodic composition, and by that I mean from like the 50s and 60s, but now it is a lot more pronounced, from the lyrical cadence of The Governor and Three Sides of Nazareth to the blatant doo-wop stylings of the backing vocals and melodies on History Lesson, or rather on-the-nose showcase of instrumentation matching a lot of the lyrical content. Of course, this does not mean that these are conventional pop songs. Far from it. 4 of the 6 tracks go past the 6-minute mark, and it becomes clear that the pop structure is used to compose the grooves that the wiry, sparking synth will evolve and devolve against over time. And sometimes they don't evolve at all. The long, quiet opening of The Killing Time hits glassy breakpoints against cascades of piano before the melancholic piano melody establishes itself and the deeper, clanking echo forms that beat, the ominous force that assumes more definition as the album continues through wailing, synthesized backing vocals. The Governor might take a pop form in some of the vocal melody, but the frenetic beats crib from like a Jlin-esque footwork song, and the elongated sax synth solo that drags through the mix section seems to push that ominous atmosphere. And despite the numerous examples of Spanish language samples across the entire record, it becomes much more prominent on the Latin-inspired synth and groove of No, as the song structure decomposes and then reforms around sandy textures, rattling strums, and shrill echoing tones across the mix, even glitch sparking around all the percussion. Now my favorite case here, probably Three Sides of Nazareth, if only because the melodic progression is the most intense as it rides against the oily waves of distortion and glitch, even though I wouldn't quite say it ever hits a direct climax, which granted is better than Leaves, which is barely an interlude with the Japanese-inspired plucked strings and the warbling synth effects that don't really evolve in a way that I think it's all that interesting. It's probably the weakest track here. Of course, the record isn't really aiming for that direct direct climax either. More of a warning against incoming disaster, the message of which Nicolas Jaar takes directly to the microphone in abstract but pretty pointed lyrics. Now, as a singer, I tend to like him in his lower, more reserved, more hushed tones. So The Governor, No, and Three Sides of Nazareth, they work pretty well for me in comparison with some of the crooning on Killing Time, and especially History Lesson. That vocal tone just didn't work for me, but now we gotta get into the content. Now, as I already implied, Nicolas Jaar is taking an international perspective on the increased polarization of the United States and the rise of the current president-elect. And there are moments of hope on Killing Time and No, the former case showing how old paranoia can die off with time and progress, and the latter showing the strenuous effort taken in fighting against stagnant or corrupt systems, especially when society is naturally predisposed to inertia. And Jaar seems very well aware that he could fall into the same mold in 20 years, so now he's gonna fight, and they did win. But the rest of this record, it's warnings. The Governor digs into the ignorance at the top still being embraced by a desperate and addicted audience, cultivating the lingering despair in the youth that nothing will change, nothing will be the same, so why engage, why bother? Ignoring all the alarms as some embrace a deicide monk tendency, blending religious fervor to slay whatever is at the top, with a blind nun representing the ones committed to the system, specifically one person committing to the system, and yet who's unwilling to truly take seriously the tyrant coming. After all, meaning is useless to the already sick. And the political subtext becomes outright text on Three Sides of Nazareth and History Lesson, directly highlighting the moral contradictions and polarization, accusing one side of having no morals while relaxing their own morals in order to attack, all while so many smart men just do nothing. Nicolas Jaar is drawing a direct parallel with the rise and tyranny of Pinochet in Chile, the brutal, borderline fascist dictator who ruled throughout the 70s all the way to the embrace of democracy in the 90s. And, well, the current president-elect, described as a man who wore his pain like a list of all that he knew, a wild string of grudges with plenty of revenge in sight now that he's got power. Of course, despite how prescient and genuinely unsettling a lot of this warning is, it's kind of undercut in a few important ways. First, it's not like Jaar is making music that's gonna reach a larger audience or convey that sort of dramatic urgency. Probably not the best idea to begin with the complacency of Killing Time, or undercut your tighter constructions with extended tracks that take the template of pop before spiraling off into more experimental soundscapes. There's a reason why a lot of punk music was fast and to the point. More importantly, it's an inexact parallel, and that does hurt the message. Pinochet took power in a military coup that was reportedly backed by the US CIA, whereas a subset of the United States chose this path. And while of course Jaar was laying out the message that they might actually had a choice to avert a nightmare, and he couldn't have possibly known what was going to happen, but the reality is that too many didn't make that choice, or didn't make what some might consider the right choice. And a tighter focus on that choice's importance and consequences might have made the themes of this album linger a lot more powerfully. As it is though, the more I dug into the writing and subtext of Sirens, the more I did like it. I just wish the actual song construction and the glitch came together a little bit more strongly, carry a little bit more of that personality, that same eclectic blend that last album really had. The majority of it is here, but muted and darker, rendered even more so by what happened on election night. And while Sirens weathers the aftermath better than, say, Black America again, it captures a moment and loses the tension of what might have been in substitution for the lingering despair of what is. As such, for me it's a light 7 out of 10, but it's kind of a tough album to recommend, not just because of the sound, but the deeper context. It sure as hell is not a cathartic listen if you still need one. But you know what? If you're curious for some well-written, fascinatingly unique electronic music, Nicolas Jaar, he did deliver here. So again, if you're curious, check this out. It's worth it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I can imagine this review might get a little controversial given the politics and all this, but here's the poll up here so you can talk about the album and whether or not I got this right, because I get the feeling that a lot of people really did adore this. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. But if you guys want to get involved more in the album scheduling process, I got the link to my Patreon right over here, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on that album, and once a week on Saturdays, you guys get to add albums to that list, providing you're at the right Patreon level. More details right there. I'd be happy to have you on board. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.